No big reveal on Red Square this May 9th, but is the devil in the detail of Vladimir Putin's Victory Day speech. In commemorating the win over the Nazis in World War II, the Russian president did not, as some predicted, declare war on Ukraine or announce a mass mobilization, at least not yet. He did, however, single out the perceived aggression of, quote, America and its minions. A bit of bluster? Or can he still spring a surprise? What would be the interest in, say, drawing NATO members directly into the conflict? While Russia failed to produce sizable gains to celebrate, the West continues, meanwhile, to ramp up support. The U.S. First Lady, the Canadian Prime Minister, the latest top officials to visit Ukraine, and the EU drawing closer to an oil embargo on Russia. Then there's Victory Day itself. Vladimir Putin has made May the 9th the most sacred day on the Russian Federation calendar, with the fight for Ukraine also becoming a battle over memory of what former Soviet republics call the Great Patriotic War. We'll be asking our panel about it today in the France 24 debate. We're looking at what some describe as Russia's victory mania. Joining us from is our Moscow correspondent, France. She's here in the studio. France 24's Elena Voloshin. Thanks for being with us.
Good evening, François.
From Moscow, Alexandra Filipenko, Senior Research Fellow at the Russian Academy of Sciences Institute for U.S. and Canadian Studies. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
From Leicester, he's a Senior Fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, Anatol Lievin. His books include Ukraine and Russia, a Fraternal Rivalry. Thanks for joining us.
Hello.
And from Oxford, Jade McGlynn, Senior Researcher at the Monterey Initiative in Russian Studies. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation, and you have on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Yet, no big announcement, no victory to declare on Victory Day. James Mazzino, though, has more on a ceremony that, well, the whole world watched.
In his opening remarks at Russia's annual Victory Day parade, Vladimir Putin lays out his view on the war in Ukraine.
Our soldiers fought the enemy near Moscow and Leningrad, Kyiv and Minsk, Stalingrad and Kursk, Sevastopol and Kharkiv. And now these days you are fighting for our people in the Donbass, for the security of our homeland, Russia.
Comparing his invasion to when Russia defended itself against Nazi Germany in World War II, Putin says that the West refused any constructive dialogue prior to the war. The Russian leader claims Western powers were seeking to invade Russian territory, leaving him with no choice but to carry out what he calls a special operation.
Everything suggested that a clash with neo-Nazis, backed by the United States and their little friends, would be inevitable.
Silence falls over the Red Square to honor Russian soldiers who've died in Ukraine. No formal declaration of an annexation of the Donbass region, now largely under Moscow's control, and neither has Putin ever officially declared war on Ukraine.
Elena Voloshin, who are the United States' little friends that Vladimir Putin's talking about?
This is the usual Russian narrative saying that United States were the enemy planning to attack Russia, and the little friends, the little allies, is Europe, which just doing everything, anything United States want from them. This is like a classical narrative construction, which presents eventually Russia as the state that is under aggression from the West, so United States first and followed by Europe, and the place where everything takes place at the borders of Russia is Ukraine. Ukraine, in the Russian narrative, is called a proxy. And the narrative says that the US, NATO are leading a proxy war towards Russia. That's why maybe somewhere we can understand why Vladimir Putin is talking about a defensive operation, and that today the great inheritance of the heroes that fought Nazi in the Great Patriotic War are the ones that heroically defend our motherland, because the motherland was threatened by the West through Ukraine. That's the West that supports Nazis in Ukraine, as Vladimir Putin puts it.
And Alexandra Filipenko, is this just a normal Victory Day speech, or did it feel different?
Well, it felt a little different because, first of all, we were expecting something very dramatic or scary. And I would say that no one really, I don't know that so many people would listen to this speech at any other year. But this year, everyone was listening and catching every word. But this speech, actually, it reminded me mostly of what I can hear if I turn on Russian television, Russian state television. That's basically the only television that we have. So usually it's an inspiring speech, but now it's a speech that mostly just repeats what we've been hearing from Russian propaganda days and days, that Russia didn't have a choice, that we have to defend ourselves, that we have to finish the job that our forefathers started in defending the world from Nazis, etc., etc. Everything that's been repeated over and over on state television. So the speech was not special at all. I mean, the speech itself, but of course the situation around it is really scary. And
sorry, let me interrupt you for 1 second, Alexandra. You say usually those speeches are inspiring. Did this one feel dark?
Exactly. Usually they are inspiring or even touching. They are mostly similar to those speeches that President Zelensky made today. Maybe you've seen his video, a very inspiring and touching video. And usually those speeches are about those who fell protecting the Soviet Union, and those who fell protecting the whole world from Nazis. And this speech was, of course, all about that special military operation that we have to call it, that's happening in Ukraine. It was in the background all the time. So it was not inspiring. It was even well, for me it was a little different. It was somehow on the defensive almost.
Almost on the defensive. We talked about what was in it. Let's talk about what was not in it. No mention, for instance, of Mariupol in Vladimir Putin's speech. There was a May 9th ceremony after all, albeit scaled back in a city where the fighting is far from over. Anatol Lievin, is this what you were expecting, his speech?
To be honest, I was waiting to see. There have been so many predictions that he would announce mass mobilization, but one couldn't be sure. I entirely agree with previous speakers. This sounded very defensive because obviously the war has gone very badly for Russia. You know, he can't claim, as you say, complete victory in Mariupol because they haven't yet conquered the whole of Mariupol. He can't claim complete victory in the Donbass. They haven't conquered the whole of the Donbass. So he really, in this speech, had to present Russia as on the defensive, and he had to play up. And by the way, I mean, by no means entirely inaccurately, but still, he had to play up the notion that this is really an American war against Russia, and therefore, by implication, Russia's difficulties in the war can be blamed not on the Ukrainians, but on America.
The follow-up from that, does that mean afterwards that we can expect Russia to strike back if, as earlier Elena said, that all the other countries are just proxies for the United States?
Well, that would represent a really drastic escalation on Russia's part if, of course, it started hitting the West directly. But if the Russian army continues to fail in Ukraine, or if the Ukrainians actually manage to counterattack successfully, then there would obviously be a tremendous temptation for the Kremlin to perhaps strike Poland, NATO supply lines, in an effort not to defeat NATO, but to terrify the Europeans, the French and Germans in particular, into seeking a peace agreement.
You agree with that, Jade McGlynn?
Broadly, yes. I do agree with Anatol and also with the previous speakers. Personally, I wasn't ever really convinced that Putin was going to make any such announcement about mobilization. instead, and perhaps this is reflective of my research, which focuses more on memory, I imagined that there would be a speech that was very focused on the idea that the current war in Ukraine is not only a defensive war of cultures and sort of in civilizational language, but also it's a war to remember war. So it's a war to liberate Ukraine and Ukrainians so that Ukrainians can remember World War II in the correct, i.e. in the Russian. Of course, in a way, the fact that he hasn't spoken about mobilization, I think in certain ways it speaks both to his power and to the limitations of Putin's power, in the sense that, of course, mobilization would be deeply unpopular among many segments of society. But also, it talks to the fact that perhaps there wasn't really any. This was a victory day without a victory, as Anatol quite concisely said. And I think that, but he still isn't under the same pressures as perhaps, well, as definitely a democratic leader would be, to miraculously victory.
We heard Alexandra Filipenko a moment ago flesh out the contrast between the speech given by Vladimir Putin and the what was said in that video address by Ukraine's president. Let's listen to Volodymyr Zelensky.
Today, May 8th, is a key date of remembrance for all the victims of World War II, for the fragility of peace and the inadmissibility of any anti-humanist regimes. The fact is that for others today, it is a memory, but for our people, unfortunately, this is the news every day. Just yesterday, in the village of Bilohorivka, Luhansk region, 60 people were killed by a Russian bomb. Peaceful people. They were hiding from shelling in the building of a regular school, which was attacked by Russian airstrikes. To do so is to imitate precisely the evil that the Nazis brought to Europe.
Jade McGlynn, are we overusing on both sides the word Nazi?
Mm-hmm. I certainly think that the word Nazi is being overused on the Russian side. On the Ukrainian side, I find it quite interesting, actually, to see Ukraine really reclaiming this past, because often we see in Russia there's this attempt to nationalize the Soviet Union's victory over Nazism, as if it were just 27 million Russians who died, rather than 27 million Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Kazakhs, as if it were a Russian rather than a Soviet victory. We see this quite a lot. So I think it strikes me as a rather positive thing that Ukraine is also, because Ukraine has every right to that legacy as well, and that it's also seeking to reclaim it. And Ukraine is of course fighting a war of self-defense against aggression from the outside. In terms of what's happened, and I believe we're going to talk about Pobeda Biesia, sort of victory frenzy or victory mania later on in the debate, but I do think that it's quite clear that the memory of World War II and the cult that has been made around the victory of 1945 has become something that unfortunately now perverts that same memory and those same veterans that it claims to be honouring.
Well, let's talk about that. It was in 2020 that Vladimir Putin put remembrance of what's called the Great Patriotic War in the preamble to the Constitution. To call it the Great Patriotic War means World War II for the Russians started in 1941, 2 years after Hitler and Stalin concluded a secret pact where they carved up Poland with attacks from either side, as depicted in this Life magazine illustration from the end of the war. A carve-up of Poland that lasted until June of 1941, when Hitler decided to invade the Soviet Union. You can see Elena Voloshin on this map, 3 Polands, the Poland of what was the part that's surrounded with the dark lines, the lines of 1933. Then it was carved up into 2 in 1939. And then, of course, in yellow is Poland as it stands today, with the stripy bits as well. But in any case, I see that you brought, by the way, you not only did your homework, you brought your textbook with you. Tell what have you got there?
Yeah, I brought the history book that is the official history book for Russian pupils. the school book for 16 years pupils, 10th grade. Here, it has been re-edited in 2021, and the history has been completely rewritten. I'm reading, and it's like I'm reading a parallel history, just like Vladimir Putin is building a parallel reality today for the Russians, and we can understand from this textbook why. Because, for example, you said the division of Poland following the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact signed between under Hitler and Stalin, the pact of non-aggression is presented here like Stalin had no choice than to take this difficult decision, and we hear like same things today with Putin, who had no other choice than to take a difficult decision. There are lots of parallels between Stalin and Putin, and we more understand from this textbook, for example, why Putin is kind of rehabilitating Stalin and just playing the same history to, on the eyes of his people.
Is that something new, rehabilitating?
No, it's not new at all. Actually, what we are seeing now in Russia, but I'll go back to this, is the implementation by Vladimir Putin of a project that he has been building for 20 years now. But I'll go back to that. I just want to mention the division of Poland, for example, that you just mentioned. How it is presented is in this textbook is like Polish government interpreted this pact, Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, as a division of its country. But it was, in fact, but you see the relativization that is put inside this words and inside its story, history that's being written, saying that, and also they say like this pact, it was just like any regular international agreement, so it minimalizing the alliance between Hitler and Stalin, because we know that this is like sensitive thing when you want to write the history of Stalin, like the great hero who did everything right. And today there is this glorification, this heroization in Russia, also to say Russia is always on the good side of history. So this kind of difficult episodes, it's relativized, it's minimalized. It's like nothing like, for example, the secret protocol that was included in this pact that for years the Soviet Union has denied. Now they speak about this protocol, but they just say, like, for example, Baltic countries, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, they voted, the government change, and they passed in the Soviet Union just by voting the new communist.
They did a referendum.
Yeah, they did a referendum.
Like
they asked the USSR to annexate it, etc. As we know, the occupation of this country following this Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was a very violent history with invasion. But invasion is always presented, just like Putin does today, as liberation, not as occupation, but just as liberation of territories.
Why does he have to do that? After all, he's not president of the Soviet Union. He doesn't have to justify.
Exactly. This is very important. You asked about the differences between this parade, this speech, and the previous one, because we know that since '95 and even most under Putin, this parade takes place every year, and under Putin it has become bigger and bigger and bigger celebration each year. But this year it's different because we are just in a different country. We are not in Russia anymore. For Vladimir Putin, country is USSR in the borders of the Russian Empire, and that's also written in this textbook, where they say that Stalin, by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, he just could retake territories that was initially under in the legitimate borders of the Russian Empire. So it is for example, Russian state TV channels, they changed today, showing the parades in different cities. They changed the words for the communist names, the Soviet names of the cities. For example, they mentioned Leningrad instead of St. Petersburg, then mentioned Stalingrad instead of Volgograd. So in the eyes of Russians, we were in the Soviet Union now. That's what justificates what Putin does today in Ukraine, because for Putin, Ukraine has no right to exist as a state, because he even mentioned when he told this speech on the 22nd of February that the creation of Ukraine within the USSR by Lenin was a historical mistake, and that we should have done what Stalin wanted, autonomous regions within the USSR. So what Putin is presenting is like a utopia which has already become reality for Russians, and that's how Russian propaganda and Russian history works today. Putin writes in advance. It's called in French auto-realizing prophecy,
self-realizing
exactly. Thank you. So they are creating situation which does not exist, but which eventually comes to exist because he's in war, because he used military to eventually lead towards the achievement of this history. And there were no mention, you said there were no mention of Mariupol, but there were no mention of Ukraine in the speech, because Ukraine doesn't exist, and there is parallel reality, because you see this glorification, this parade, like it was a celebration. But we have to remind that today Putin is under investigation for war crimes by the International Criminal Court. You have thousands of Russian soldiers dying in Ukraine, but they have a celebration for the victory in the Great Patriotic War. They don't mention, Putin said, each soldier that dies for Russia is a tragedy for us, but he doesn't give numbers, he doesn't give a toll. And this means, like, yes, somewhere there is a special operation, but Russia is not in this reality a country which is at war now. So war is everywhere, but it is nowhere. It doesn't exist in reality. It just has something to be a glorification of a great project that he's achieving now, but that has been written for years now in Russia, in Putin's Russia.
Alexander Filipenko, when you talk about World War II, what is fact is that all of the former Soviet states paid a very heavy price and fought courageously to defeat the Nazis. There were an estimated 20 to 26 million killed during World War II. The reading of history, as described there by Elena Voloshin, do ordinary Russians agree with it?
Well, I would say that unfortunately most Russians are taught by exactly those textbooks that Elena showed you, and I would just add a few things, just facts, because I can say too many words about it, analyze it too long. So just a few facts. For example, I'm sorry for turning it on myself, but my great-grandfather was killed during the Stalin terror. I don't want to get into that, but of course he was rehabilitated. He was considered to be a spy for 5 countries, but there was no case. He was, of course, rehabilitated, and we managed to get his case in 1990s from the archives of KGB, and his brother was also murdered and also considered to be a spy, also rehabilitated, but note, his case is still secret in the archive of the KGB, even though he was rehabilitated after being murdered in 1937. So as you can imagine, those documents somehow are still meaningful in Russia, and still there are so many archives unopened, still secret in Russia, even though we are in a different country. And coming back to Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, again, sorry for talking about myself, but for me personally, it's a very painful subject, because I used to teach history, well, actually US-Russian relations, in the institute for the third year students, and I stopped when there was a new law adopted that you could not compare Soviet Union and the Third Reich in any way. Now you can go to prison. I can not only go to prison for saying a W word, a war, instead of a special military operation, but also if I compare Soviet Union's actions and the Third Reich actions during any period of time. So talking about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and the Second World War that started in 1939, not the Great Patriotic War that started in 1941, that's a bit dangerous now. And I personally, maybe I was, it makes me a little cowardly. It sounds a little cowardly, but I was scared to continue teaching students of the third year and talking about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And I didn't want to lie. I didn't want to just not talk about it. And so those little facts are, I think, quite showing that Russians are actually, most Russians, I would say, well, I'm very lucky that I can talk to you. I know English and I can find my sources elsewhere. But most Russians get their information from state TV. They get their information from those textbooks. And yes, it was exactly, Elena is absolutely right. It was crippling new historical reality, I would say. I remember, I was just 7 years old, but I remember for my grandfather who fought in World War II, it was extremely important, and he was very happy that in 1992, the parade, the 9th May parade, that was always very important for Russia and before that for the Soviet Union, actually there were American soldiers, British soldiers, French soldiers, and everyone gathered in Russia, in Moscow. And there were soldiers from all over the world. They gathered, and there was this commemoration. This was the parade that is not even a parade. It was a march, a memory march, and that resonated with never again. Not we can repeat. Now with Putin, the main sentiment is that we can repeat. We can repeat that. And even Volodymyr Zelensky said, noted that difference, that in the Western world, it's never again. But for Russia, it's we can repeat. So it changed in years. It changed, and for last 20 years, it's been obvious. And also, I'm sorry, just one last point regarding school books. I think it's very important, even though it's not directly connected to the subject right now. But there is an information we have to see in September that in new textbooks for school children starting from 3rd grade in 2022. There will be no mention of Ukraine, and new editors are supposed to erase the mention of the country, of the word Ukraine, because of course Russia started from Kiev. It was Kiev Rus. So I'm very interested to see how will they manage to do it. But there was from the Ministry of Education, there was this information that now editors have to edit out even the word Ukraine. They want to even erase it somehow.
Anatol Yevin, when you hear Alexandra Filipenko describe her grandfather in that memorial march back in 1992, what happened since? Why this divergence when it comes to memory?
Well, I mean, clearly, Putin regime has based itself ideologically on an amalgam of Russian nationalism, traditional Russian nationalism, and the Soviet legacy. I have to say, not in defense of this, but just to, to bring out the complexity of a lot of this, that Western countries as well have had a difficult time, shall we say, coming to terms with the light and dark aspects of their history, including in the Second World War. I am old enough to remember when the documentary Le Chagrin, la Pitié came out in France and was, of course, banned.
It was banned in 1972, yeah.
Indeed. One should remember that. One should also perhaps remember that there has been a very determined attempt on the part of Poles, of course, in particular, but other allies in the West, to use the equation between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, as a political weapon against Russia, and really to equate the Soviet defeat of Germany and conquest of Eastern Europe in 1945 with the Nazi invasions. Now, that was always going to produce a very bad reaction in Russia. And finally,
and on that point, I'm sorry, my Russian's a bit rusty, and Elena's looking at me, so I'm going to try to say this word right. Podebosie, the memorial fever that the Russians have, is it the same on the other side when Poland's?
May I correct you, François?
You correct me.
Победобесие.
Победобесие,
But it's a neologism, so we forgive you.
All right. When you talk about memorial fever, Anatol, is it the same on the Russian and Polish side?
Pretty much, I'd say. I mean, there's a lot of, not as much, of course, but coming from Britain, so much of the British population lives in a still in a kind of dream world about British victory in the Second World War. We're kind enough to acknowledge that America provided some transport on D-Day for the British Army, and the Soviet or Russian role is hardly mentioned in schools, in my children's schools. So, obviously Russia under Putin has been particularly bad. But one shouldn't forget that both in Poland and in the West more widely, the memory of the fact that Poland participated in Hitler's carve-up of Czechoslovakia in 1938 is completely forgotten, and very deliberately so. So, I agree entirely. There is now massive falsification of the past by the state in Russia, but I think other countries don't have the right to be completely self-righteous on that subject.
Jane McGlynn, you agree?
I do, actually. I think that it's not helpful to completely pathologize what's happened in Russia as the process, this conflation of past with present, this constant use of a mythologized history to legitimize current policies and the current regime. I actually think it's a process that we see around the world. I think perhaps we might all remember some of the references to Britain standing alone during the Brexit campaign. What's different is the level of extremity and the way that I would say that this Pobeda-bietia, this sort of victory mania, has become also quite banal. It's become part of everyday life, and we've seen these pictures, of little children in tanks dressed up as World War II or Great Patriotic War Army soldiers. And it's the way that this cultish treatment of the victory has entered every sphere of Russian life. From making Victory Day salads to after-school battle reenactment clubs or summer camps where you learn how to conduct historical propaganda. And I think that this is something. Go on.
The question then, Jade, is to what ends? Where is this all leading us?
I think that the end of it has been essentially to provide a unifying idea, because that was something, particularly in the Yeltsin era, that was a bit of a struggle, is to sort of articulate this coherent idea of what it means to be a Russia, why there should be a Russia, and for different reasons. You couldn't go too far down ethno-nationalism because there's so many nationalities, religion. There are 4 official religions in Russia. Civic nationalism wasn't going to work under Putin for pretty obvious reasons. And also, there's no real ideology as such. It's sort of a mosaic. So, but history, pride in the Great Patriotic War and pride in that victory over Nazism is one of the things that really does bring a lot of Russians together. So it's become this cohering idea. For a long time, to be honest with you, and I've been researching this since 2014, I thought that this was just quite a cynical use. But I think the invasion of Ukraine shows that actually Putin and many of those around him clearly believe actually in some of the narratives that they're using, because otherwise their actions don't make sense. And there it's probably worth remembering their age and the fact that these are very Soviet men, and they are largely men.
Yes, so largely men. Elena Voloshin, you can accuse the Russian leadership of being cynical, but on this point you agree with Jade that this is something they firmly believe in, that idea of a greater Russia that's fighting the enemies.
Yes, because that's the way the propaganda puts it. And Russians, what they do say today is that if we were not leading the special operation of denazification in Ukraine, today we Russian people would be in the shelters under bombings from NATO or from Ukraine, or you don't really know whom from, and that's it. I see that there is a temptation to say that Russia is rewriting the history, but also all the countries also do. So do other countries, etc. But I think today we must just we can criticize the different politics, different historical perspective, and etc. What we just should focus on today is that no other country in the world is leading an open aggression towards the neighbor country, rewriting completely on the opposite the history of their acts, and that's it. And again,
you can't equivocate.
No, yeah, we can, and forbidding everyone from even not only from criticizing it, but in his country, but just from discussing it, as it was mentioned just before. You have no right today to question this version of Vladimir Putin that his country is defending itself and not aggressing the neighbor country. And even I'd go even further. When he doesn't mention Ukraine, when he wants to erase Ukraine from textbooks, what does it mean? It's just a genocidal idea that Ukraine has no right to exist as a country, that Ukrainians has no right to exist as nations. That's why also he makes the amalgam, He mixes up nationalism and Nazism, because nationalism is an infection, as he said, and that's the absolute evil that Russia should eradicate from Ukraine, and that's what may explain also the actions of Russian army in places like Bucha. The war crimes, assumedly that we saw, is because Russians today are thinking that Russians and Ukrainians not only are brother people, but are the same people, and that the Ukrainians does not have to right to exist and should be erased from history, erased from existence, and be integrated to Russia.
Alexandra Filipenko, you talked earlier about how the view of May the 9th has evolved over the past 2 decades. In Russia, how about in Ukraine? How is it different today than it was 20 years ago?
Well, first of all, I must say that, as you know, in France and in the whole world, everyone is celebrating the end of the Second World War, in Europe at least, on May 8th. And in the Soviet Union, there's always been this celebration on May 9th. Officially, it's because the capitulation of Germany was signed at 11 p.m. Berlin time, while in Moscow it was already 1 p.m. Moscow time. It was already May 9th. So it's an official version, but there's an unofficial version that Stalin, who was the head of the Soviet Union at the time, just wanted to have his own special celebration and to divide himself from allies after everything was over. He wanted just to say that we have our own holiday. So during Soviet times, of course, in Kiev, as in all Soviet capitals, the celebration was on May 9th. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union, after Ukraine became independent, first they celebrated it, also celebrated, exactly, that's the right word, on May 9th. And gradually they started commemorating May 9th as for the fallen soldiers. And traditionally, veterans come and place flowers by Bitkivshina Mat. That's the main monument that in the center of Kiev that commemorates the fallen. And on May 8th, they would celebrate with the whole world and would invite foreign leaders, etc., on May 8th. So in the past 20 years, Russia moved into, again, dividing itself from the West and stating that only May 9th is the holiday and the main day for celebration, not commemoration, but mainly celebration. And in Ukraine, gradually, they moved everything to May 8th. And saying never again, Nikoly znovu. That's the main words that we hear on those days. While even in 1990s, it was, we can repeat again, it's the sentiment brought from Russia mainly. So only in the past years, it's been mainly celebration on May 8th. So that's how Ukraine moved mostly towards the West. And also, I suppose that this also somehow irritates the Kremlin and irritates President Putin, maybe even personally. As we know, he doesn't even mention President 8th.
And it was a busy May 8th in Ukraine. There was the U.S. First Lady in Lviv visiting with her Ukrainian counterpart. There was the Canadian Prime Minister who was in the capital. And the battle of hearts and minds fought in the Kyiv metro system when the Ukraine group Antilia paired up with familiar faces. take on John Lennon's Stand By Me, Stand By Ukraine. Anatol Yevin, I don't know if Bono and the Edge are going to win the war for Ukraine, but when you're watching these kinds of images from Russia, what can the reaction be? Again, because we're in this battle for hearts and minds and this us versus them mentality.
Well, yes. I mean, I have to say just a couple of things there. I mean, first is, with regard to the Second World War, never again is a European sentiment to a considerable extent. It's not an American one, because the Americans won the Second World War at very low cost to themselves. And of course, the idea that America has abandoned the idea of aggressive war is a joke in terms of American policies over the past generation. The other thing I do have to say is that I must protest against the misuse and overuse of the word genocide. On both sides, Putin's use of it with regard to the Ukrainians is of course a grotesque lie. But to equate, the desire to dominate Ukraine with Hitler's genocide of the Jews or the Rwandan genocide is a real insult to the victims of true genocide.
But what about when the word Ukraine is banned from textbooks? What does that signal? I mean, there is this accusation that's been leveled that the Russians are dehumanizing Ukrainians.
Dehumanization is part of war. I used to be a war correspondent. I saw it very often. But I mean, the thing is, the Ukrainians have maintained their nationhood, whatever Putin and the Russians may say. But there is no intention to exterminate the Ukrainian people. I mean, apart from anything else, there are numerous people of Ukrainian origin. I mean, enormous numbers in Russia, considerable numbers within Putin's own regime. So this is war, but it's not genocide. And I think it's very dangerous casting what's happening in these absolutist terms, because Zelensky himself has said that every war in the end ends in a peace agreement. Unless you believe that there can be total victory over Russia, in the end, there will have to be an agreement. If you cast Putin as an embodiment of absolute genocidal evil, like Hitler, then by definition there can be no agreement and there can be no end to this war, short of the complete destruction of the Russian army in Ukraine, or indeed perhaps of Russia itself. And now, one should be very, very careful about setting off on that road.
Jade McGlynn, you agree?
I'm not sure I do, actually. So genocide is a legal term, it's a legal definition, and it's notoriously slippery, I suppose, as a term, for want of a better word. That is a question really for legal scholars to decide. I'm obviously not a legal scholar working in the field of genocide, but I have to say that I don't feel offended. I don't feel offended by people using that term. I think that there's quite a strong case, as it seems to me, as a layperson.
As a historian, I have to disagree completely. I'm sorry, it's a matter of common sense. If what happened in Bucha is genocide, then every Western army at one stage or another has been guilty of that. What Hitler did, what happened in Rwanda was completely different.
But what's happened, I mean, it's kind of, I'm not here to sort of compare anybody to Hitler. The point is simply that there's, of course, what happened in Bucha, but there's also what happened in Irpin, there's what's happened in lots of other places that we've still yet to see. I certainly wouldn't have the confidence to sit there and say that there isn't a genocide, particularly when every day, you're reading op-eds, in state media saying denazification means de-Ukrainianization. I don't really understand where the idea that Putin doesn't want to sort of destroy the idea of Ukraine as a concept. I don't understand why you disagree with that, because I think they've been quite blunt about wanting to do that.
We're running short on time. Elena Voloshin, again, that brings back this concept of denazification. What does it mean?
Yeah, exactly. I'd like just to say one simple thing. There will be an international investigation to find out whether what happened in Bucha and many other localities in Ukraine, because that's not the only case of systematical killing of people that happened there, whether was the reasons to do that, whether it was a genocide or not. There is an international investigation. What I want to put a stress on is that, and why I said that Putin in his speech has a genocidal ideas and theories. I didn't say that Russia was leading a genocide. I don't know. The international justice will find out. But in his very speeches, in his statements, in the ideas that are put forward by Russia today, there is an idea of purificate Ukraine. There are terms. There is a propaganda. There is an official narrative, which brings us to a very totalitarian one. And it is very scary when you hear that, when Putin is speaking of purification, traitors, denazification, because again, nationalism is put on the same level than Nazism. That means that Ukraine, again, in Putin's, and it's as simple as that, in Putin's mind state, and as is putting it, it has no right to exist, and that's it. So that's why the totalitarian language, the totalitarian rhetoric today, which is in Russia, it's very dangerous and may explain some things that happens on the ground in Ukraine today.
Certainly a red flag, and how you get to the bargaining table is another question we should definitely broach next. I want to thank you so much, Elena Voloshin. I want to thank Alexandra Filipenko in Moscow, Anatol Yevin in Leicester, Jade McGlynn in Oxford. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.